The night he fainted before I even touched him. He told me he wasn't afraid of needles. He said it the way people say they're not afraid of heights, right before they grab the railing with both hands and go very, very still. I noticed his fingers first. He had them laced together in his lap, pressed so tight the knuckles had gone white. And he was smiling, big, easy smile, the kind that takes effort to maintain. "I'm good," he said. "Totally fine. Do whatever you need to do." I set my kit down on the hotel nightstand, next to a half-eaten granola bar and a room service menu, and I thought, okay, sure, we'll see. I didn't know yet that this night was going to teach me something I hadn't expected to learn. Not about veins, not about technique. Something else entirely. Something I still think about when I'm on a long flight and the cabin goes quiet and I have nothing to do but remember. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. It was July, one of those July nights where the heat doesn't break even at midnight. It just sits there, heavy and still, like it forgot to leave. I was staying in a mid-range hotel, in a city I'd been to once before for a conference, and I was there again for the same reason, a 3-day medical training seminar, continuing education. The kind where you sit in a conference room under fluorescent lights and drink bad coffee and try to absorb information about updated protocols while your brain quietly begs for a nap. I'd finished the evening session around 9, gone back to my room, changed into something comfortable, and was genuinely looking forward to doing absolutely nothing for the next 8 hours. And then my phone rang. It was the front desk, which was already unusual. They said there was a guest on the 4th floor, I was on the 3rd, who had asked if there was anyone in the hotel who might have medical training. Apparently he'd mentioned it to the concierge, who had mentioned it to the front desk manager, who had somehow found out that I'd listed my profession when I checked in. I want to be clear, I am not an emergency responder. I'm not on call when I travel. I had no professional obligation to say yes. I said yes anyway. I always say yes. I've made peace with that about myself. His name was Daniel. He opened the door on the second knock, which told me he'd been standing close to it, waiting. And the first thing I noticed was that he looked embarrassed. Not sick, not pale, just deeply, thoroughly embarrassed. He was maybe 35, tall, dark circles under his eyes, the kind of tired that comes from traveling across time zones rather than from not sleeping. He was wearing a t-shirt from some university I didn't recognize and holding a piece of paper, which he immediately handed to me like it was evidence. It was a prescription, handwritten, slightly crumpled, with a pharmacy label on a small box sitting on the desk behind him. "My doctor faxed this to a pharmacy near my office," he said. "I picked it up before I flew out. I'm supposed to have gotten the injection 3 days ago, but I kept..." He stopped, started again. I kept putting it off. I looked at the prescription. Vitamin B12 injection, intramuscular, 1 milliliter. I looked at him. "You've been carrying this in your bag for 3 days?" I said. 4, actually. 4 days. "I was going to find a clinic," he said it quickly. "I looked some up. I just never, the seminar schedule and then the time difference and, I said. He looked at the window. "And I don't love needles." There it was. I almost smiled. I kept it small. "Okay," I said. "I can help with that." Here's the thing about people who say they don't love needles. They're not wrong to feel that way. The fear is completely rational. Your body has spent your entire life learning that sharp things breaking through skin means something bad is happening. That's not a flaw in your wiring. That's your wiring doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The problem is that sometimes you need the sharp thing, and the fear gets in the way. What I've learned, and this took years honestly, is that the fear almost never lives in the needle itself. It lives in the anticipation, in the waiting, in the not knowing when it's going to happen and how much it's going to hurt, and whether the person holding the syringe actually knows what they're doing. That last one is the biggest one, trust. That's what the whole thing is about. So I washed my hands at his sink, 20 seconds, all the way up to the wrists, between the fingers. And while I did, I talked to him. Not about the injection, about the hotel, about the conference I was attending, about whether he'd eaten dinner, which he hadn't, which was a separate conversation we needed to have. I asked him what he did. He said he was an architect. I said I'd always thought architecture and medicine had more in common than people realized. Both of them were about understanding how structures hold together under pressure. He gave me a look like he wasn't sure if I was serious. I was a little serious. By the time I turned around and dried my hands, his shoulders had dropped about 2 inches from where they'd been when I walked in. Small victories. I opened the kit I'd brought. I travel with a small one, just basics, force of habit, and laid out what I needed on the desk. A fresh syringe, the vial, alcohol swabs, a small piece of gauze, gloves. I pulled the gloves on, that familiar snap of latex settling against my palms, and I drew up the medication. This is the part most people don't see, and it matters. When you draw up a solution into a syringe, you pull back the plunger slowly, let the liquid fill the barrel, and then, and this is important, you hold it up to the light and look at it. Check for clarity. Check the color matches what you expect. Check the volume. And then you deal with the air. There's almost always a small bubble or two. You hold the syringe with the needle pointing up. Tap the barrel gently with your finger, just a few light taps, and watch the bubbles rise to the top. Then you push the plunger just slightly, just enough to express the air out through the needle tip. You don't want air in a muscle. It's not the catastrophic thing movies make it out to be in an intramuscular injection. That's more of a concern with intravenous. But it's uncomfortable, and there's no reason to include it. So you take the extra 30 seconds. You do it right. Daniel was watching me do this from across the room. "You're very calm," he said. "One of us should be," I said. He laughed. It was a real one, surprised out of him. Good. For a B12 intramuscular injection, the deltoid, that's the muscle in the upper arm, the rounded one that sits just below the shoulder, is one of the preferred sites when the volume is 1 milliliter or less. It's accessible, it's well vascularized, and for most adults it has enough muscle mass to accept the medication comfortably. I asked him to sit on the edge of the bed and let his arm hang loose at his side. This is the part people always get wrong when they do it themselves, or when someone untrained tries to help them. They tense up, they hold the arm rigid, or they pull it toward their body, or they clench the muscle because they're bracing. And a tense muscle hurts so much more than a relaxed one. The needle has to push through the resistance, and the medication has to spread through tissue that's fighting it. So I said, "Drop your shoulder, like you're trying to make your arm as heavy as possible." He tried. He was still holding some tension. "Think about your elbow," I said. "Just focus on your elbow. Let it get heavy." Something in his face shifted, that particular internal redirect, and I felt the muscle change under my fingers when I rested my hand lightly on his upper arm to assess the site. Just the lightest touch, through the glove. Enough to feel the difference between contracted and released. There it was. He'd let go. The landmark I was looking for, 2 to 3 finger breadths below the acromion process. That's the bony point at the very top of the shoulder, the little ledge you can feel if you press along the top of the shoulder blade. You find that point, you measure down, and you're in the belly of the deltoid. That's your target. Not too high where the muscle is thin and the bone is close. Not too low where the radial nerve runs and you absolutely do not want to be. I cleaned the site with an alcohol swab, let it dry for 10 seconds, because wet alcohol stings more, and also affects the skin's integrity slightly, and then I held the skin taut with my non-dominant hand. Take a breath in, I said. He did. Now let it out slowly. And on the exhale, when the body naturally releases, when the nervous system takes its small rest between one breath and the next, I inserted the needle, 90 degrees, straight in, confident, one smooth motion, not slow, not hesitant. Hesitation is what causes pain. The needle that goes in with purpose causes a fraction of the sensation of the one that creeps. He made a small sound, not pain, surprise. That's it, he said. That's it, I said. I'm going to give the medication now. You might feel some pressure. I pulled back the plunger slightly, just a small aspiration, checking that I hadn't accidentally entered a vessel. Clear. Good. Then I pressed the plunger down slowly and steadily, not fast. Fast causes the medication to spread too quickly, and that's where the ache comes from. Slow and even, about 10 seconds for 1 milliliter. He was quiet. His breathing was steady. When the barrel was empty, I withdrew the needle at the same angle it went in, straight out, no angling, and pressed the gauze to the site immediately. Light pressure. A few seconds. Done, I said. He turned his head and looked at me like I'd just told him something he wasn't sure he believed. He stopped. That was nothing. I know, I said. Here's what I didn't tell him in that moment, but I'll tell you now. The reason it was nothing had very little to do with the needle, and almost everything to do with the 30 minutes before it, the conversation, the washing of hands while I talked about unrelated things, the question about dinner, the trick with the elbow. The injection itself takes 10 seconds. The preparation, the real preparation, the human part, takes as long as it takes. I've done this procedure hundreds of times. The ones that go badly are almost never about technique. They're about a patient who was never made to feel safe, who was sat down, swabbed, and stuck before they had a chance to exhale. The body remembers fear. It stores it in the muscle, and then the muscle fights you. But a body that trusts, that's a completely different experience for both people in the room. I was putting the used needle into the small sharps container I carry. You never recap, never set a used needle down. It goes directly into the container, no exceptions. This is non-negotiable. When Daniel said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said. "Why do you travel with a kit?" I thought about it. "Same reason you travel with a phone charger," I said. "Because the one time you don't have it is the one time you need it." He considered this. "Has anyone ever told you that's a very specific kind of optimism?" "Pessimism," I corrected. "Optimism is thinking nothing will go wrong. What I have is," I searched for the word, "preparedness, which is optimism's more useful cousin." He smiled at that. And here's the thing I wasn't expecting. It was a completely different smile from the one he'd opened the door with. That first one had been armor. This one was just a smile. I should tell you, I almost left then. I had my kit repacked, my gloves off and disposed of, and I was genuinely planning to say goodnight and go back to my room and sleep for 8 hours. But then he mentioned the dinner thing. He said, "You asked earlier if I'd eaten. I haven't." I was going to order room service, but I kept not doing it. I looked at him. "How long have you been on the plane today?" 11 hours. "And before that?" "A connection, 3 hours in an airport." I did the math. "So you've had, what, a granola bar?" I nodded toward the nightstand. He looked at the granola bar like he'd forgotten it existed. "Half of one." I sat back down. Here's the thing about B12, and about long flights, and about the particular kind of exhausted that Daniel was. They compound each other in ways people don't always recognize. Vitamin B12 is essential for nerve function, for red blood cell production, for energy metabolism at the cellular level. A deficiency, even a mild one, doesn't just make you tired, it makes you foggy. It makes your hands feel slightly disconnected from your brain. It makes the world feel like you're watching it through slightly dirty glass. And then you add dehydration, because airplane cabins run at about 10 to 20% humidity, which is drier than most deserts, and most people don't drink nearly enough water on long flights, and you have a body that is running on fumes and doesn't entirely know it. I told him this. Not in a lecture, just mentioned it. The way you'd mention to a friend that the reason they have a headache is probably because they haven't had water since this morning. The headache you have right now, I said, is almost certainly dehydration. He touched his temple. I have a headache. I know. You've been squinting since I walked in. He blinked. I didn't realize. Most people don't. I reached into my kit and pulled out a small electrolyte packet. I carry 2 or 3, again, preparedness, and handed it to him. Drink a full glass of water with this before you sleep, and order food, something with protein. Your body needs something to work with. He looked at the packet, then at me. Are you always like this? Like what? Like... He waved a hand vaguely, like someone who notices things. I thought about that for a moment. I think I just pay attention, I said. It's the job. You look at a person and you try to understand what they actually need, not just what they're asking for. He was quiet for a second. He asked for the injection, he said slowly. But what he actually needed was to eat something and drink water and have someone talk to him for half an hour. And the injection, I said. He needed that too. Right, he smiled again. And the injection. There's a moment in this kind of encounter, and I've had enough of them to recognize it now, where the clinical part is finished and something else takes its place. Not anything dramatic, just a shift in the quality of the air in the room. The transaction is complete. What remains is just 2 people, in a hotel room, at midnight, in a city neither of them lives in. It's a particular kind of intimacy, that moment. Not romantic, or not only. Something older than that. Something about the fact that this person let you close enough to help them, and now they're sitting across from you with their guard completely down, and you're both aware of it. I wonder sometimes if you've felt that, not necessarily in a medical context, maybe just with a stranger on a train who told you something true about themselves, or a friend who let you see them cry for the first time. That specific quality of closeness that only exists because neither of you planned for it. I find it, I don't know, quietly extraordinary. He did order food eventually. I know because I was still there when it arrived. We'd gotten into a conversation about structural engineering and the human spine that neither of us had planned on having, and somehow 40 minutes had passed. The food came. He ate. His color improved visibly, which I noticed in the way I notice everything. Not intrusively, just, I was watching, the way I always watch. Before I left, I told him 2 more things. The first, the injection site might be a little sore tomorrow. That's normal. The muscle has absorbed a foreign substance and it's responding. If he wanted, he could apply a warm compress, not ice, warmth, for 10 minutes. It would help the medication disperse through the tissue and ease any residual ache. Ice constricts, warmth opens. For this kind of soreness, you want open. The second thing I told him was about the B12 specifically. He'd mentioned his doctor had prescribed a series of injections, not just one. I asked if he had a plan for the rest of them when he got home. He made a face that told me he did not have a plan. Make the appointment before you leave the hotel, I said. Not when you land, not when you get back to the office. Now, tonight. Put it in your phone. You're very bossy for someone who's technically off duty, he said. I'm never off duty, I said. It's a character flaw. He laughed, and then he said, "Thank you, really." And the way he said it, not for the injection or not only, I understood that. I walked back to my room at just past 1 in the morning. The hallway was quiet, that specific hotel hallway quiet that feels like the whole building is holding its breath. The carpet was that particular shade of burgundy that every mid-range hotel seems to have agreed upon at some point in the 90s and never revisited. I thought about what he'd said, about noticing things. I've been doing this long enough that the noticing has become automatic. The slight asymmetry in someone's posture that suggests they're guarding something. The way a person breathes when they're in pain versus when they're afraid. The difference between a headache from tension and one from dehydration. Dehydration tends to sit at the base of the skull. Tension wraps around the temples, and they respond to completely different interventions. These are things you learn over years. Over hundreds of patients and thousands of small moments of paying attention. But I think the noticing, the real noticing, the kind that matters, isn't actually a medical skill. It's a human one. It's just choosing to look at the person in front of you and ask yourself, what do they actually need right now? Not what's on the chart, not what they said when they walked in. What do they actually need? Sometimes it's an injection. Sometimes it's 40 minutes of conversation and a glass of water with electrolytes. Usually, it's both. Here's the part I didn't mention yet, the part I was holding back, because it only makes sense now, at the end. When Daniel had opened the door and handed me the prescription, I'd glanced at the date on it. The prescription was dated 6 weeks earlier. Not 4 days, 6 weeks. He hadn't been putting it off since he got on the plane. He'd been putting it off for a month and a half. I didn't say anything about it at the time. It wasn't my place to make him feel worse about it. But I thought about it on the walk back to my room. 6 weeks of carrying a piece of paper around. 6 weeks of knowing you need something and finding every possible reason not to get it. Not because you're irresponsible, not because you don't care about your health, but because the fear, the small, specific, completely irrational fear of a needle, was just enough friction to let procrastination win, over and over again. And I thought about how many people are doing that right now, not with injections necessarily, with the appointment they haven't made, the symptom they've been ignoring, the thing they know they should do, but keep finding reasons to defer. The friction doesn't have to be large, it just has to be slightly larger than the motivation. And fear, even small fear, is very good at being friction. I don't know what to do with that exactly, I just notice it. The seminar the next morning was about updated protocols for wound assessment. I sat in the 3rd row and drank bad coffee and took notes, and at some point during the morning break, I checked my phone and found a text from an unknown number. Ate breakfast, drank water, made the appointment. D. I stared at it for a second. Then I put my phone back in my pocket and went back to my seat. And I thought, sometimes the thing that breaks the 6 weeks of friction is just someone showing up. Someone who washes their hands and talks about something unrelated and tells you to let your elbow get heavy. Someone who notices. His arm wasn't shaking when I left the room. He'd been still for a long time by then, still in the way people get when they've finally exhaled something they'd been holding for a while. I'd walked in to find a man pretending not to be afraid. I walked out, leaving one who wasn't pretending anymore. That's the part I didn't know at the beginning. When I said this night was going to teach me something I hadn't expected, I thought it was going to be about technique, or about some unusual presentation, or about some clever clinical insight I could file away. But it was simpler than that. It was just, sometimes the bravest thing a person does all day is open the door.